Hello, my beautiful souls. I'm sitting here today, looking at you through this screen, and my heart is beating so fast, because what I'm about to share with you, it's taken me 43 years to find the courage to speak these words out loud. My name is Dorothy Mae Richardson, but everyone calls me Dot, and I'm 72 years old now. I've lived through things that no woman, no human being, should ever have to endure. Before I begin, I need something from you. I need you to understand that this story isn't just mine. It belongs to every woman who has suffered in silence, every mother who has lost what she loved most, every soul who has been broken by the very people who were supposed to protect them. So please, if this story touches your heart, share it. Let other women know they're not alone. And tell me in the comments where you're watching from: Chicago, Miami, somewhere in Texas, maybe even from another country entirely. I read every single comment, every single word you write to me, because your stories give me strength to continue sharing mine. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Now, let me take you back to where it all began. I was born in 1952 in a small farming town called Millerville, about 30 miles outside of Springfield, Missouri. It's one of those places where everybody knows everybody, where secrets travel faster than gossip, and where family reputation means everything. My daddy, Harold Richardson, owned a decent-sized farm, corn and soybeans mostly, and in our community, that made us what folks called respectable. But let me tell you something about respectability. Sometimes it's just a mask that hides the ugliest truths. My family wasn't like other families, though from the outside we probably looked picture perfect. There was Daddy, of course, a tall, broad-shouldered man with hands like hammers from working the land since he was 12 years old. Then there was my mama, Susan Richardson, a tiny bird of a woman who barely reached Daddy's shoulder but had a tongue sharp enough to cut glass when she was riled up. I had 3 older brothers: James, the eldest at 6 years older than me, then Thomas, 4 years older, and Robert, just 2 years my senior. James was Daddy's golden boy, already 21 when I was 15, and being groomed to take over the farm someday. He was married to a local girl named Patricia and lived in the little house Daddy had built on the east corner of our property. Thomas had just graduated high school and was working full-time on the farm, dreaming of the day he could afford his own land. Robert was the wild one, always getting into scraps at school, always pushing boundaries but somehow never getting in real trouble, because, well, he was a Richardson. And then there was me. The only girl. The unexpected one. The one who came along when Mama thought she was done having children. Pauvre. Growing up as the only daughter in the Richardson family was like walking on a tightrope every single day. I had to be pure enough to maintain the family honor, strong enough to work alongside the boys when needed, quiet enough not to embarrass anyone, but smart enough to be useful. It was an impossible balance, and I spent most of my childhood feeling like I was failing at all of it. Our house was a big, old farmhouse that had been in Daddy's family for 3 generations. White clapboard siding that needed painting every few years, a wraparound porch where we'd shell peas in the summer, and a kitchen that always smelled like whatever Mama was canning that week. My bedroom was upstairs, right next to my parents' room, which meant I heard everything. Their fights, their reconciliations, their late-night conversations about money and crops and which of their children was causing them the most worry that week. Money was always tight, even though we never went hungry. Farming is a gamble every single year. You plant your seeds and pray the weather cooperates. The market holds steady and nothing goes wrong. But something always went wrong. Too much rain, not enough rain, prices dropping just when you needed them most, equipment breaking down at the worst possible time. I learned early that our family's mood rose and fell with the fortunes of the farm. When times were good, Daddy would come home whistling, maybe bring Mama flowers from the side of the road, and we'd have music playing during dinner. When times were bad, which was more often than not, the house would fill with a tension so thick you could cut it with a knife. That's when Daddy's temper would flare, when Mama's criticism would turn cruel, when my brothers would look for someone weaker to take their frustrations out on. And I was always the weakest one in the room. Don't get me wrong, they never beat me or anything like that. The Richardson family prided itself on being civilized, Christian people. But there are ways to break a person's spirit without ever laying a hand on them. A look of disgust when you spill something at dinner. A comment about how you're getting too fat, too thin, too tall, too awkward. Questions about why you can't be more like the Morrison girl down the road who was so helpful to her mama, so quiet and sweet. I learned to make myself invisible. I did my chores without being asked, kept my grades up at school, never caused trouble, never asked for anything extra. I thought if I could just be perfect enough, good enough, invisible enough, maybe they'd leave me alone. Maybe they'd even love me the way they loved my brothers. School was my escape. Millerville Elementary and later Millerville High were small. My graduating class had exactly 37 students, but the teachers were good people who saw something in me that my family didn't seem to notice. Mrs. Henderson, my fourth grade teacher, was the first person who ever told me I was smart. Really smart. She started giving me extra books to read, harder math problems to solve. She'd keep me after school sometimes, not as punishment, but just to talk about the stories I'd read or the poems I'd tried to write. "Dorothy," she'd say, "you have a mind that's meant for bigger things than Millerville. Don't you ever forget that." But bigger things seemed impossible when you're a Richardson girl. Girls in our family were meant to help on the farm until they married local boys and started having babies. College was for boys, for people with money we didn't have, for families who thought education was more important than tradition. By the time I turned 16, the pressure to find a suitable husband was starting to build. Mama would point out boys at church, mention how the Patterson boy was doing so well at his daddy's hardware store, how the Williams family was looking for a nice girl for their youngest son. She'd criticize my appearance more frequently. Why wasn't I wearing more makeup? Why didn't I style my hair better? Why was I so quiet around boys? "You're getting to be an old maid already," she'd say, even though I was just 16. "Pretty girls don't stay pretty forever, Dorothy. You need to catch someone while you still can." The truth was, I wasn't particularly pretty. I was tall for a girl, 5'8" by the time I stopped growing, with brown hair that never seemed to hold a curl and green eyes that Daddy said were too serious for my own good. I wasn't ugly, but I wasn't the kind of pretty that made boys write poems or fight over you either. I was just ordinary, but ordinary was enough for Kevin Michael O'Brien. I met Kevin at a church social in the spring of 1969, right after I turned 17. He was new to town, had moved down from Kansas City with his mama after his daddy died in a factory accident. Kevin was 22, had a job at the grain elevator, and most importantly, he seemed genuinely interested in me. Not just in how I looked or what my family owned, but in what I thought about things, what I dreamed about, what made me laugh. He was handsome in a quiet way, medium height, sandy brown hair, blue eyes that crinkled when he smiled. He had gentle hands and a gentle voice, and when he talked to me, he looked right at my face like what I was saying actually mattered to him. We started seeing each other regularly, always properly chaperoned, of course. Kevin would come to Sunday dinner, help Daddy with some of the heavier farm work, sit on the porch with me in the evenings while Mama kept watch from the kitchen window. He never tried to push boundaries or make me uncomfortable. He treated me like I was made of something precious. Demborka. For the first time in my life, I felt like maybe I was worth something after all. My family approved of Kevin, which was both a relief and somehow disappointing. I think part of me had hoped that finding love would be more dramatic, more romantic, than just checking off boxes on my parents' list of requirements. But Kevin was steady, employed, respectful, and most importantly, he wanted to marry me and settle down right there in Millerville. He wasn't going to take me away from my family or put any crazy ideas about leaving town in my head. We got engaged on Christmas Eve, 1969. Kevin had asked Daddy's permission the week before, and the whole thing was arranged so properly, so correctly, that it felt more like a business transaction than a proposal. But when he slipped that little diamond ring on my finger, it was tiny, but it was real, and it was mine. I felt something I'd never felt before. Hope. Pure, bright hope that my life was about to begin. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Kevin and I were married on June 14, 1970, in the little white Methodist church where 3 generations of Richardsons had said their vows. It was a small ceremony, maybe 60 people total, but it felt like the grandest celebration in the world to me. I wore my mama's wedding dress, altered to fit my taller frame, and carried wildflowers that Kevin had picked himself from the meadow behind his mama's house. Mrs. O'Brien, Kevin's mother Margaret, was nothing like my own mama. Where my mother was sharp angles and cutting words, Margaret was all softness and genuine warmth. She was a widow trying to make it on her own, working as a seamstress to support herself, but she never complained about her circumstances. When Kevin told her he wanted to marry me, she just smiled and said, "If she makes you happy, son, then she makes me happy too." I remember thinking on my wedding day that maybe this was what a real family felt like. Margaret hugged me like she meant it. She cried real tears during the ceremony. Not tears of worry or obligation, but tears of joy. When people asked her about gaining a daughter-in-law, she'd light up and say, "I didn't gain a daughter-in-law, I gained a daughter." Those words meant more to me than all the wedding gifts combined. Kevin had rented us a little house on Maple Street, just 4 blocks from the main square of Millerville. It wasn't much. 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, a kitchen barely big enough for a table and 2 chairs, but it was ours. For the first time in my 18 years, I had a space that belonged to me, where I could make decisions about how things should be arranged, what we should have for dinner, when the curtains should be opened or closed. The freedom was intoxicating. Ha 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 ha. Those first months of marriage were like living in a dream I'd never dared to have. Kevin would leave for work at the grain elevator every morning at 6:30, and I'd pack him a lunch with little notes tucked inside. Nothing fancy, just "have a good day" or "love you" written on scraps of paper. He'd come home at 5:15 every evening, tired and dusty, but always with a smile for me and a story about something that had happened during his day. We'd cook dinner together in that tiny kitchen, bumping into each other and laughing about it. After we ate, we'd sit on our little front porch and wave to neighbors walking by. Kevin would tell me about his dreams. Maybe starting his own feed store someday, maybe buying a few acres and raising some cattle, maybe even taking a trip to see the ocean, which neither of us had ever laid eyes on. I started to have dreams too. Real dreams, not just the careful hopes I'd been allowed to have as a Richardson daughter. Maybe I could take some classes at the community college in Springfield. Maybe I could learn to drive. Kevin had promised to teach me once we got settled. Maybe I could start a little garden in our backyard, grow vegetables and flowers, just because I wanted to, not because someone needed me to. For the first time in my life, the future felt like something I had a say in. I got a job at Henderson's 5 and Dime, working 3 days a week for Mrs. Carol Henderson, the same woman who had been my 4th-grade teacher. She was retired from teaching now but had bought the store when old Mr. Peterson decided to sell. Working there felt like a gift. I helped customers find what they needed, kept the inventory organized, and learned how to work the cash register. Mrs. Henderson treated me like a capable adult, asking my opinion about which items to order and trusting me to make decisions when she wasn't there. "You're a natural at this, Dorothy," she'd say. "You understand people, and you're not afraid of hard work. Those are rare qualities." The work gave me confidence I'd never had before. When customers thanked me for helping them find exactly what they needed, when Mrs. Henderson praised how I'd handled a difficult situation, when I successfully balanced the register at the end of the day, these small victories built something inside me that I'd never known I was missing. Self-worth, that's what it was. For the first time, I felt like I had value beyond just being someone's daughter or someone's wife. Kevin was proud of my job too. He'd stop by the store sometimes on his lunch break, not to check up on me, but just to say hello and maybe buy a candy bar or a pack of gum he didn't really need. I could see the way he looked at me when I was helping a customer or explaining something to Mrs. Henderson, like he was impressed by me, like he was lucky to be married to someone so capable. My family's reaction to my newfound independence was complicated. Mama thought it was unnecessary for me to work when Kevin had a steady job, but she couldn't argue with the extra money I was bringing in. Daddy worried that I was getting too big for my britches, but Kevin always deflected those comments with respect and humor. My brothers mostly ignored the whole situation. which was actually a relief. The only real tension came from my brother Robert, who was now 20 and still living at home, still acting like the rules didn't apply to him. He'd make snide comments about how I thought I was too good for the family now, how marriage had made me uppity. When Kevin was around, Robert kept his mouth shut, but when it was just family, he'd find ways to needle me. "Little Dorothy thinks she's a businesswoman now," he'd say with that smirk that had been getting him in trouble since he was 5 years old. "Wait until real life hits you, sister. You'll come running back home crying soon enough." I learned to ignore Robert's comments, but they planted a seed of worry that I tried hard not to water. What if he was right? What if this happiness was temporary? What if I wasn't strong enough for real life? Whatever that meant. But then Kevin and I started talking about having children, and those worries got swept away by a tide of excitement and possibility. We'd been married about 8 months when the subject first came up seriously. We were lying in bed on a Sunday morning, lazy and content, listening to the church bells ring across town. Kevin was tracing patterns on my shoulder with his finger, and out of nowhere he said, "What do you think about us having a baby?" My heart nearly stopped, not from fear, but from the sudden rush of joy that flooded through me. I'd always assumed I'd have children someday. It's what women did, especially in Millerville. But I'd never really let myself imagine what it would feel like to want a baby, to plan for one, to dream about holding my own child. "I think," I said carefully, "that would be the most wonderful thing in the world." Kevin's whole face lit up. "Really? You want to be a mama?" "More than anything," I admitted. And as soon as I said it, I knew it was true. We started trying right away, and I threw myself into preparing for the possibility of pregnancy, with the same enthusiasm I'd once reserved for perfect report cards and spotless chores. I read every book about babies and child-rearing that I could find at the library. I started saving money from my job for baby clothes and furniture. I even began eating differently, making sure I got enough milk and vegetables, taking better care of myself because I might be taking care of someone else soon too. Margaret O'Brien was over the moon about the possibility of becoming a grandmother. She started knitting tiny blankets and sweaters, just in case, and she'd share stories about Kevin's infancy that made him blush and made me fall in love with him even more. She told me about how he'd been such a content baby, rarely crying, always observing everything around him with those serious blue eyes. "He's going to be such a good daddy," she'd say, watching Kevin help fix something around her house or seeing how gentle he was with the neighbor's cat. Some men have to learn how to be tender, but Kevin was born that way. My own family was more reserved about our baby plans, which didn't surprise me. Mama made practical comments about how expensive children were and how much work they'd be. Daddy worried about whether Kevin made enough money to support a family properly. My brothers seemed to think the whole thing was mildly amusing. Little Dorothy playing house, pretending to be a grown-up. But I didn't let their lukewarm response dampen my excitement. This was my life now, my marriage, my future family. Their approval would be nice, but it wasn't necessary for my happiness anymore. Happier but happier. It took 6 months of trying before I missed my first period. Then I missed my second. By the time I finally worked up the courage to see Dr. Morrison, the only doctor in Millerville, I was almost 10 weeks along. "Congratulations, Mrs. O'Brien," Dr. Morrison said with a genuine smile. "You're going to have a baby." I burst into tears right there in his office. Happy tears, overwhelmed tears. Tears of pure joy and terror and excitement, all mixed together. Dr. Morrison handed me a tissue and assured me that crying was perfectly normal for expectant mothers. When I told Kevin that evening, he picked me up and spun me around our tiny kitchen until we were both dizzy and laughing. Then he set me down very carefully, like I was made of glass, and placed his hand on my still flat stomach. "Hello in there, little one," he whispered. "We've been waiting for you." That night we lay in bed, making plans and dreaming out loud. If it was a boy, we'd name him David Michael after Kevin's father. If it was a girl, maybe Sarah Margaret, after Kevin's mother. We'd convert the second bedroom into a nursery. We'd save up for a car so we could take family trips. We'd give our child everything we'd never had. Unconditional love, encouragement to dream big, the security of knowing they were wanted and cherished. I was 3 months pregnant and floating on pure happiness when everything started to fall apart. But that's a story for the next part of my journey. For now, just know that for those brief, shining months, I believed that love was enough to protect us from anything. I believed that happiness, once found, would last forever. I had no idea how wrong I was. The first sign that something was wrong came when I was 4 months pregnant, and starting to show. I was working at Henderson's Five and Dime on a Tuesday afternoon when my brother Robert walked in. This wasn't unusual. People stopped by the store all the time, but something about the way he looked at me made my skin crawl. I was helping Mrs. Patterson find some yarn for a baby blanket she was knitting for her new granddaughter when Robert appeared at the end of the aisle. He didn't say anything, just stood there watching me with this strange expression on his face. When Mrs. Patterson left, he finally approached the counter. "So it's true then," he said, his eyes fixed on my growing belly. "You're actually having a baby." "Yes, Robert," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "Kevin and I are very happy about it." He laughed, but it wasn't a happy sound. "Happy? Right. You know what Daddy's been saying, don't you?" I didn't want to know, but I could see in his eyes that he was going to tell me anyway. "He's been saying that Kevin's paycheck from the grain elevator isn't going to stretch far enough to support a family. Says you'll both come crawling back to the farm before the year's out, expecting him to feed another mouth." My hands trembled as I reorganized some items on the counter, trying to look busy. "Daddy's wrong. We're managing just fine." "Are you?" Robert leaned against the counter, his voice dropping lower. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you're about to bite off more than you can chew. And when you do, guess who's gonna have to deal with the consequences?" Before I could ask what he meant by that, Mrs. Henderson came out from the back room, and Robert straightened up, putting on his charming smile, the one that had gotten him out of trouble his entire life. "Afternoon, Mrs. Henderson," he said politely. "Just stopped by to check on my little sister." After he left, I couldn't shake the feeling that his visit hadn't been about concern. It felt more like a warning. Or a threat. That evening, I told Kevin about Robert's visit, trying to downplay my uneasiness. Kevin frowned, wrapping his arms around me from behind as I stood at the stove stirring soup. "Your brother's just trying to get under your skin," he said, pressing a kiss to the top of my head. "We're doing fine, Dot. Better than fine. Don't let him make you worry about things that aren't worth worrying about." But the worry had already taken root, and it grew stronger over the next few weeks as more little incidents began to pile up. There was the Sunday dinner at my parents' house where Daddy made pointed comments about how much food I was eating, how expensive it was going to be to feed a growing family, how young people these days didn't understand the value of money. Kevin handled it with grace, changing the subject and refusing to take the bait, but I could see the tension in his jaw. There was the afternoon when my brother James stopped by our house unexpectedly, ostensibly to help Kevin fix a loose board on our front steps. But while Kevin was out back getting tools, James cornered me in the kitchen. "You know, Dorothy," he said, his voice carrying that tone of authority he'd inherited from Daddy. "Patricia and I have been talking. When this baby comes and money gets tight, and it will get tight, you might want to consider moving back home for a while, just until Kevin can find better work." "We won't need to do that," I said firmly. "Kevin's job is steady, and I can work part-time even after the baby comes." James shook his head like I was a naive child. "You don't understand how expensive babies are. Diapers, formula, doctor visits, clothes they outgrow every few months. Kevin's a good man, but he's not a Richardson. He doesn't understand responsibility the way we do." The way he said "we" made it clear that I wasn't included in that group anymore. I was an O'Brien now, which apparently made me an outsider to the family I'd grown up in. These conversations always left me feeling unsettled and defensive, but I tried to push the feelings aside. My family had always been critical, always looking for problems that might not exist. This was just more of the same, amplified by their general discomfort with change. But then the financial pressure started to become real. In my 6th month of pregnancy, Dr. Morrison informed me that I would need to have the baby at the hospital in Springfield rather than at home with a midwife, as we'd originally planned. There had been some complications in my pregnancy. Nothing dangerous, he assured me, but enough to warrant extra medical supervision during delivery. "It's going to cost more," Kevin said that night as we sat at our kitchen table with bills spread out in front of us. "Probably twice what we budgeted for." I watched him run calculations on a piece of paper, erasing and rewriting numbers, trying to make them work out. The grain elevator had cut everyone's hours slightly due to a slow season, and my income from the store had decreased as my pregnancy progressed and I couldn't work as many shifts. "Maybe I should pick up some extra work," Kevin said finally. "Johnson's farm has been looking for weekend help." "Kevin, you're already working 6 days a week," I protested. "You need rest too." "I need to provide for my family more than I need rest," he replied, but I could hear the exhaustion in his voice. That night, lying in bed with Kevin's arm around me and the baby kicking against my ribs, I felt the first real stab of fear. Not fear about the birth or about being a good mother, but fear about what would happen if we couldn't make ends meet. Fear about what my family would say, and what they might do, if Kevin and I had to ask for help. The fear intensified when I overheard a conversation between my parents and brothers that I was never supposed to hear. We. It was a Saturday evening in late October. I was 7 months pregnant, moving more slowly than usual, and Kevin was working an extra shift at the elevator. I'd stopped by my parents' house to drop off some preserves that Margaret had made. She was always sending food over for my family, trying to build bridges, even when they didn't seem particularly interested in being built. I was about to knock on the front door when I heard my name mentioned inside. Something in the tone made me pause and listen instead. "The girl's gotten herself in over her head," Daddy was saying. "Kevin's a decent enough fellow, but he's not equipped to handle a family on what he makes. I told Dorothy she should consider coming back home after the baby arrives," James's voice responded. "Just temporarily until they get back on their feet." Temporarily. That was Thomas speaking, and there was something in his laugh that made my blood run cold. "You really think Dorothy's going to want to leave once she's back under this roof? You think Kevin's going to be able to afford his own place and a baby on his salary?" "What are you suggesting?" Mama's voice, sharp with interest. "I'm suggesting," Thomas continued, "that maybe Dorothy needs to understand that some decisions aren't hers to make anymore. She's carrying a Richardson grandchild. That baby's going to be family, whether Kevin likes it or not." "The boy's got no backbone anyway," Robert chimed in. "Did you see how he just sat there last Sunday when Daddy was talking about financial responsibility? A real man would have defended his wife. A real man would have thought about how to support a family before getting his wife pregnant," Daddy added. There was a murmur of agreement, and then James spoke again. "If push comes to shove, we might have to help them understand what's best for everyone involved. Dorothy's always been too emotional to make good decisions. She needs guidance." "What kind of guidance?" Mama asked. The silence that followed was somehow more frightening than anything they'd said out loud. I backed away from the door on shaking legs, my heart pounding so hard I was afraid they might hear it. I walked around to the back of the house and knocked on the kitchen door instead, pretending I hadn't heard anything. But I couldn't pretend I hadn't understood the message. My family was making plans for my life, plans that didn't include my consent or Kevin's. They saw my pregnancy not as our joy, but as their opportunity. An opportunity to bring me back under their control, to prove that I couldn't make it on my own, to show Kevin that he wasn't man enough to take care of a Richardson woman and child. That night I told Kevin what I'd overheard, and for the first time since I'd known him, I saw real anger flash in his gentle blue eyes. "They can't force us to do anything, Dot," he said firmly. "You're my wife. This is our baby. We make the decisions about our family, not them." But even as he said it, I could see the doubt creeping in. Kevin had grown up without a father, with just his mother who loved him unconditionally and never questioned his choices. He didn't understand families like mine, families where love came with conditions and strings attached, families where manipulation was as natural as breathing. I wanted to believe him. I wanted to trust that love and determination would be enough to protect us from whatever my family was planning. But deep in my heart, a voice was whispering that we were in more danger than Kevin realized. A voice that said my family wasn't going to let me go without a fight. And as I lay there in the dark, feeling my baby kick and listening to Kevin's breathing slow into sleep, I had no idea how brutal that fight was going to be. November arrived with an early cold snap that seemed to freeze more than just the air around Millerville. It froze the last of my hope that my family would accept my choices and let Kevin and me live our lives in peace. I was 8 months pregnant now, moving like a ship in full sail, and every day felt like a countdown to something I couldn't quite name. The baby was due in early January, and Dr. Morrison had confirmed that I would need to deliver at Springfield General Hospital. The cost estimate he'd given us made Kevin's face go pale, but he just squeezed my hand and said we'd figure it out. What we didn't figure out was how quickly my family would move to help us, whether we wanted their help or not. It started with small things. Mama began showing up at our house unannounced, always with some excuse. She'd brought soup because I looked tired, or she wanted to check that we had enough winter clothes for the baby, or she'd heard Kevin coughing and thought he might be getting sick. But her real purpose became clear when she'd walk through our little house with sharp eyes, taking inventory of everything we owned. "This crib looks awfully rickety," she'd say, shaking the secondhand baby bed we'd bought and painted ourselves. "A baby could get hurt in something like this." Or she'd open our refrigerator and frown. "Not much food in here for a woman who's supposed to be eating for two. Are you sure Kevin's providing properly for you?" Every comment was designed to plant seeds of doubt, to make me question whether we were really prepared for parenthood, whether our humble home was good enough for a Richardson grandchild. I tried to defend our choices, but pregnancy had made me emotional and tired, and sometimes I found myself crying after she left, wondering if she was right. Kevin saw what was happening and tried to shield me from it. He'd come home from work to find me upset and would hold me while I cried about something my mother had said. "She's trying to undermine your confidence," he'd tell me. "Don't let her. We're going to be wonderful parents, and our baby is going to be loved and safe here with us." But the pressure wasn't just coming from Mama. James started dropping by Kevin's workplace, making comments to Kevin's supervisor about how worried the family was about Kevin's ability to support a wife and child on his current salary. He never said anything directly threatening, but the message was clear. The Richardson family had influence in this town, and they weren't afraid to use it. Thomas began showing up at Henderson's Five and Dime when I was working, making loud comments about how pregnant women probably shouldn't be on their feet so much, how it wasn't good for the baby. Mrs. Henderson stood up for me, but I could see she was getting uncomfortable with the family drama spilling into her store. Even Robert, who usually kept his cruelty to snide comments, escalated his behavior. He started following me when I walked to work or to the grocery store, staying just far enough behind that it might look like coincidence to anyone else, but close enough that I always felt watched. When I mentioned it to Kevin, Robert would mysteriously disappear for a few days, only to return when Kevin was working extra hours and couldn't be around to protect me. The breaking point came on a frigid Wednesday evening in late November. Kevin was working overtime at the grain elevator, trying to earn extra money for the hospital bills, and I was home alone when all three of my brothers showed up at our door. I knew immediately that this wasn't a social visit. James knocked with the heavy, authoritative rap he'd learned from Daddy. Thomas and Robert flanked him on either side, their faces serious in a way that made my stomach clench with fear. "We need to talk, Dorothy," James said when I opened the door. He didn't wait for an invitation before pushing past me into our living room. "Kevin's not home," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Maybe you should come back when he can be part of the conversation." "This conversation doesn't concern Kevin," Thomas replied, closing the door behind them with a firm click. "This is family business." They sat down in our small living room without being asked, making themselves at home in a way that felt like a violation. I remained standing, one hand protectively over my swollen belly, suddenly very aware of how alone and vulnerable I was. "Sit down, Dorothy," James ordered. "You shouldn't be on your feet so much in your condition." His use of the word condition instead of pregnancy made my skin crawl, but I sat down anyway, perching on the edge of our couch like I was ready to run. "We've been talking to Daddy," James began, "and we've all agreed that this situation has gone far enough. You and Kevin are in over your heads, and it's time for the family to step in." "What situation?" I asked, though I had a sinking feeling I knew exactly what he meant. "Don't play dumb," Robert said with that familiar smirk. "Everyone in town knows Kevin can't afford the hospital bills. Everyone knows you've been working yourself to exhaustion trying to make ends meet. Everyone knows this whole Independence Act is about to come crashing down. We're managing fine," I insisted, but my voice sounded weak even to my own ears. Thomas leaned forward in his chair. "Dorothy, let me explain how this is going to work. When the baby comes, you're going to move back home with Mama and Daddy. Just temporarily, until Kevin can get himself established in a better job." "That's not going to happen," I said, standing up abruptly. "This is our baby, our family, our decision." Sit down. James's voice was sharp enough to cut glass. You're not thinking clearly. Pregnancy hormones have made you emotional and irrational. That's why you need family to help you make good choices. The condescension in his voice made my blood boil. I'm thinking perfectly clearly. Clear enough to know that you have no right to make decisions about my life. Actually, we do, Robert said, pulling a folded paper from his jacket pocket. Daddy's been talking to his lawyer. Did you know that in Missouri, grandparents have rights? Especially when the parents can't provide adequate care? My heart stopped. What are you talking about? I'm talking about the fact that if Kevin can't pay those hospital bills, if you can't provide a stable home for that baby, the court might decide that it would be better for the child to live with family members who can provide proper care. Robert's smile was cruel and triumphant. Family members like Mama and Daddy, who have successfully raised 4 children and own their own home and have never missed a payment on anything. The room spun around me. You can't? You wouldn't? We don't want to, Thomas said, his voice taking on a false tone of reasonableness. That's why we're offering you the easy way. Come home voluntarily. Let the family help you through this difficult time. Once Kevin proves he can support a family properly, you can always move back out. And if he can't prove that? I whispered. The silence that followed answered my question more clearly than words ever could. This is kidnapping, I said desperately. You can't force me to leave my husband. I won't go, I said, trying to dig my heels in as Robert began pulling me toward the door. I'll scream! I'll tell everyone what you're doing. You'll tell them what exactly? Robert's grip tightened on my arm. That your loving brothers came to take care of you when your husband couldn't afford to? That your family stepped in when you needed help? He was right, and we all knew it. In 1970, in small-town Missouri, a woman's family had absolute authority over her welfare, especially when she was pregnant and vulnerable. The idea that a woman might not want her family's help was almost incomprehensible to most people. They began moving me toward the door, Robert still holding my arm, James carrying my coat, Thomas opening the door to let in a blast of freezing November air. I was running out of time, out of options, out of hope. That's when I felt it. A sharp, sudden pain that shot through my lower back and wrapped around my belly like a vice. I gasped and doubled over as much as I could with Robert still holding me. What's wrong? James asked, immediately alert. Another pain hit, stronger this time, making me cry out involuntarily. The baby, I gasped. Something's wrong with the baby. She's faking it, Robert said, but his grip loosened slightly. She's trying to buy time. I'm not faking anything. Another contraction ripped through me, and this time I felt something warm and wet running down my legs. I looked down to see a puddle forming on our kitchen floor. My water just broke. The 3 brothers stared at the puddle in shock. Thomas was the first to speak. It's too early, he said. The baby's not due for another month. Labor doesn't always follow schedules, I managed to say between contractions. I need to get to the hospital. I need Kevin. No, James said firmly. No hospitals, no Kevin. We'll take you home. Mama delivered all of us at home. She can handle this. Are you insane? I screamed. Another contraction making me double over completely. This is premature labor. I need a doctor. I need proper medical care. But even as I said it, I realized they didn't care about proper medical care. They cared about control. Taking me to a hospital would mean doctors, nurses, medical records, official documentation of when and where the baby was born. Taking me home meant they could control every aspect of the birth, every detail of what happened afterward. Robert, go start the truck, James ordered. Thomas, help me get her to the vehicle. No. I tried to resist, but another contraction hit, this one so strong it brought me to my knees. Please, something's wrong. The baby's coming too fast. They weren't listening. Robert ran outside to start the truck, while James and Thomas each took one of my arms, half carrying, half dragging me toward the door. Every step was agony. Every movement seemed to trigger another contraction. Stop fighting us, Dorothy, Thomas said as they maneuvered me through the doorway. You're only making it worse for yourself and the baby. The cold air hit me like a slap, and I began shivering uncontrollably. Whether from the temperature or from shock, I couldn't tell. They loaded me into the passenger seat of Robert's pickup truck, James climbing in beside me while Thomas got in the back. "Drive carefully," James told Robert. "But get us home fast." As the truck pulled away from my little house on Maple Street, away from Kevin, away from safety, away from any hope of proper medical care, I felt something inside me break. Not physically, though the contractions were getting stronger and closer together. Something deeper broke, something that had to do with faith and trust, and the belief that people you loved wouldn't deliberately hurt you. "Please," I whispered one last time as we drove through the dark streets of Millerville. "Please take me to the hospital. I'll do whatever you want afterward, but please don't let my baby die because of this." "The baby's not going to die," James said with absolute certainty. "Richardson women are strong. We've been having babies on that farm for generations without any problems." But I wasn't just a Richardson woman anymore. I was Dorothy O'Brien, and my baby was Kevin's child too. That baby deserved to be born safely, to live, to grow up knowing both parents loved them enough to fight for them. As another contraction tore through me, stronger than all the others, I made a decision that would haunt me for the rest of my life. In Mayo, I stopped fighting. Not because I'd given up, but because I realized that fighting them was using energy I needed to save my baby. If they were going to force me to give birth at the farm, away from medical help, then I had to focus every ounce of my strength on keeping my child alive. The truck bounced over a pothole, sending a fresh wave of pain through my body. In the distance, I could see the lights of my childhood home growing larger, and I knew that whatever happened in that house tonight would change everything forever. I pressed my hands to my belly, feeling my baby moving restlessly inside me, and whispered a promise that I intended to keep no matter what it cost me. "I'm going to protect you," I said softly. "No matter what they do, no matter what happens, I'm going to make sure you survive this." I just had no idea how much that promise was going to cost both of us. Matter Allahatta. The next 6 hours were the longest of my life. Not just because of the physical pain, though that was unbearable, but because of what I witnessed in that farmhouse, what my own family was capable of when they believed they were doing the right thing. When we arrived at the farm, Mama was waiting on the porch like she'd been expecting us. Later, I realized this whole night had been planned, orchestrated down to the last detail. She took one look at me, doubled over in the truck, and immediately took charge. "Bring her to my bedroom," she ordered my brothers. "James, you drive to town and get Dr. Patterson. Tell him it's an emergency, but don't mention the details over the phone. Thomas, boil water and get clean towels. Robert, you stay outside and watch for Kevin." "Kevin doesn't know where she is," James said as they helped me out of the truck. "Kevin's not stupid," Mama replied sharply. "When he comes home and finds his wife missing, this is the first place he'll look." They carried me into my parents' bedroom, the same room where I'd been born 18 years earlier. The same room where I'd hidden as a child when Daddy's temper flared. The irony wasn't lost on me, even through the haze of pain. Mama examined me with the practiced hands of a woman who delivered countless farm animals and helped birth most of the babies in our rural community before Dr. Patterson arrived in town. Her face grew increasingly grim as another contraction hit me. "This baby's coming fast," she muttered. "Too fast for how early it is." "Is something wrong?" I gasped between contractions. "Everything's wrong," she said bluntly. "You're only 8 months along, your water broke under stress, and this labor is progressing too quickly. This child should be born in a hospital with proper equipment." For a moment I felt a surge of hope. Maybe Mama would overrule my brothers, insist on taking me to Springfield General despite their plans. But then she continued, "But we'll make do. We always have." That's when I understood the full scope of what was happening. This wasn't just about controlling where I lived or how I raised my child. This was about rewriting the entire narrative of my baby's birth. If my child was born here, on Richardson land, delivered by Richardson hands, then they could claim that I'd come home voluntarily, that I'd chosen family over my husband, that Kevin had abandoned me in my hour of need. Dr. Patterson arrived about an hour later, an elderly man who'd been delivering babies in rural Missouri since before I was born. He took one look at me and immediately began setting up for an emergency delivery. "This is highly irregular," he told my mother in a low voice that he thought I couldn't hear. "She should be in a hospital. If there are complications—" "There won't be complications," Mama said firmly. "Richardson women don't have complications." "There won't be complications," Mama said firmly. "Richardson women don't have complications." But I did have complications. The labor was too fast, too intense, and the baby was positioned wrong. Dr. Patterson worked frantically, sweat beading on his forehead, despite the cold November night. At one point, he looked at my mother with genuine fear in his eyes. "I'm losing them both," he whispered. That's when something extraordinary happened. Through all the pain and fear and betrayal, I heard my baby's heartbeat on Dr. Patterson's stethoscope. Faint, but still fighting. And in that moment, I found a strength I didn't know I possessed. I stopped thinking about my family's betrayal, stopped worrying about Kevin finding me, stopped caring about anything except bringing my child safely into this world. For the next 2 hours, I fought harder than I'd ever fought for anything in my life. At 3:47 a.m. on November 26, 1970, my daughter was born. She was tiny, barely 5 pounds, with a cry that sounded more like a kitten's mew than a baby's wail. But she was alive and she was perfect, and when Dr. Patterson placed her in my arms, I knew that everything I'd endured had been worth it. "What will you name her?" Mama asked, her voice softer than it had been all night. "Sarah," I whispered, remembering the name Kevin and I had chosen together. "Sarah Margaret O'Brien." The silence that followed was loaded with meaning. By giving her Kevin's last name, I was making a statement that this was still my choice, still my family, still my life to decide. "Dorothy," Mama said carefully, "perhaps it would be better to register her as Sarah Richardson, at least until things get settled with Kevin." "No." My voice was weak from exhaustion, but my resolve was iron. "Her name is Sarah Margaret O'Brien, and that's what will go on her birth certificate." Dr. Patterson looked between my mother and me, clearly uncomfortable with the family tension. "I'll file the paperwork as the mother instructs," he said diplomatically. After he left, promising to check on Sarah and me the next day, my family gathered around my bed for what they clearly thought would be a moment of triumph. They'd succeeded in getting me and the baby to the farm. They'd proven that I needed them, that Kevin couldn't protect me, that family was more important than marriage. But as I held my daughter and looked at their expectant faces, I realized something that changed everything. Wait. They'd made a critical mistake. They'd assumed that becoming a mother would make me weaker, more dependent, more willing to accept their control. Instead, it had made me fiercer than I'd ever imagined possible. This tiny girl sleeping in my arms was my responsibility now, and I would die before I let my family use her as a pawn in their power games. "When can I go home?" I asked quietly. "This is your home," Daddy said from the doorway, where he'd been watching the whole scene. "You and the baby will stay here where you can be properly cared for." "For how long?" "Until Kevin proves he can support a family," James answered. "Until he finds a better job, saves some money, shows some responsibility." "And if he can't meet your standards?" The silence told me everything I needed to know. They never intended to let me go back to Kevin. This had all been an elaborate plan to separate us permanently, to raise Sarah as a Richardson instead of an O'Brien. That's when I made the decision that would define the rest of my life. "I need to feed the baby," I said, putting Sarah to my breast. "Could you all give me some privacy?" They left, probably thinking I was finally accepting the situation, finally settling into the role they'd chosen for me. But as soon as the door closed, I began planning my escape. I was weak from childbirth, it was the middle of winter, and I had a newborn baby who could barely survive outside of controlled conditions. But I also knew that every day I stayed in this house was another day my family could solidify their legal claim to Sarah, another day they could build their case that I was an unfit mother who needed their supervision. I had maybe a week, maybe 2 at most, before their temporary guardianship became permanent in the eyes of the law and the community. The next morning, when Kevin finally found us, the confrontation was everything I'd feared and more. He burst through the front door like an avenging angel, his face wild with panic and fury. "Where is she? Where's my wife?" "She's resting," Mama said calmly. as if Kevin was an unwelcome salesman rather than a desperate husband. The baby came early. Dorothy needed family care. Bullshit. Kevin's language was so unlike him that even I was shocked. You took her. Against her will. That's kidnapping. Watch your tongue in this house, Daddy warned. But Kevin ignored him completely. I want to see Dorothy. Now. They tried to stop him, but Kevin was a man possessed. He pushed past my brothers, ignored my parents' protests, and found me in the bedroom holding Sarah. When he saw me, pale, exhausted but alive, he broke down completely. Oh God, Dot, he whispered, falling to his knees beside the bed. I thought, when I came home and you were gone, I thought they'd hurt you. They did hurt me, I said quietly, loud enough for my family to hear from the doorway where they'd gathered. They forced me to give birth here instead of letting me go to the hospital. They put Sarah's life at risk because they wanted to control where she was born. Kevin's face went white with rage. You could have died. The baby could have died. But we didn't, I said, touching his face gently. We're both alive, and we're going home. Actually, James said from the doorway, you're not. That's when they revealed the full extent of their plan. While I'd been in labor, they'd filed emergency guardianship papers, claiming that Kevin had abandoned me, and that I was incapable of caring for a premature infant. Dr. Patterson, under pressure from my family, had signed a medical statement saying that both Sarah and I needed extended medical supervision. It's temporary, Thomas said, like that made it better. Just until you both get stronger, and Kevin proves he can provide proper care. Kevin looked like he wanted to commit murder. You can't do this. She's my wife. That's my daughter. Prove it, Robert said with his trademark smirk. Take us to court. Hire a lawyer. Show a judge that you can afford to fight the Richardson family. It was checkmate, and we all knew it. Kevin made enough money to support us day to day, but legal battles cost thousands of dollars we didn't have. My family, with their land and their connections and their reputation in the community, could tie us up in court for years while Sarah grew up thinking of them as her real family. But that night, as Kevin held Sarah for the first time and I saw the love and determination in his eyes, I knew we weren't beaten yet. Humtopstower. We were just getting started. The next 3 weeks were a masterclass in psychological warfare. But this time, I wasn't just defending myself. I was learning how to fight back. My family thought they had won. They had me and Sarah under their roof, they had legal documents that gave them temporary guardianship, and they had the entire community believing that they were the heroes in this story. The loving family stepping in to help a young mother in crisis. But what they didn't count on was that I'd spent 18 years in that house learning their tactics, studying their weaknesses, understanding exactly how they operated. And now I had something they'd never given me before, a reason to use that knowledge against them. Kevin was allowed to visit, but only under strict supervision, and only for limited hours. My family treated these visits like supervised visitation with an unstable parent, making notes about his behavior, commenting on his interactions with Sarah, questioning whether he was bonding appropriately with his daughter. During one of these visits, Kevin leaned close while pretending to adjust Sarah's blanket and whispered, "I've been talking to a lawyer in Springfield. We have options." "What kind of options?" I whispered back, keeping my voice light like we were discussing the baby's feeding schedule. "The guardianship papers they filed were emergency measures," he said quietly. "They have to justify them in court within 30 days, or the judge will dismiss them automatically. But we need to document everything, every conversation, every restriction, every time they try to keep me from my family." That night, I started keeping a journal. I wrote everything down. How Mama criticized my breastfeeding technique and insisted I supplement with formula because clearly you're not producing enough milk for a healthy baby. How Daddy made comments about Kevin's inadequate job every time he visited. How my brothers took turns monitoring our conversations and reporting back anything that sounded like escape planning. I documented how they were already trying to establish themselves as Sarah's primary caregivers. How they'd set up a nursery in what had been my childhood bedroom and insisted that Sarah sleep there instead of with me. Because new mothers need their rest. How they'd started referring to her as our baby in front of visitors, as if she belonged to the family collectively rather than to Kevin and me specifically. But I also began documenting something else: their mistakes. Because for all their planning and manipulation, my family had made one critical error. They'd assumed I would remain the same frightened, compliant girl they'd always known. They didn't realize that giving birth had awakened something in me that couldn't be put back to sleep. I started small. When neighbors came to visit and see the new baby, I made sure to mention how much I missed my little house on Maple Street, and how excited I was to go home to Kevin once Sarah was strong enough. I talked about Kevin like he was a devoted husband, temporarily separated from his family by circumstances, not like an inadequate provider who'd abandoned us. When church ladies brought casseroles and baby gifts, I thanked them on behalf of Kevin and myself, and made sure they understood that Sarah was an O'Brien, not a Richardson. I showed them the birth certificate with Kevin's name clearly listed as the father, and my married name listed as the mother. I watched my family's growing frustration as their narratives started to crack. People began asking uncomfortable questions. Why wasn't Kevin living at the farm too if this was just temporary family support? Why were the visiting restrictions so strict if he was truly a welcome member of the family? Why did Dorothy seem so sad when she should be grateful for all the help? Margaret O'Brien, Kevin's mother, became an unexpected ally in this campaign. She started visiting regularly, bringing baby clothes she'd sewn and food she'd cooked, pointedly addressing me as Dorothy O'Brien in front of my family, and referring to Sarah as my granddaughter. Kevin's working extra shifts to save money for when you come home, she'd tell me in front of my mother. He's so excited to have his girls back where they belong. The contrast between Margaret's loving acceptance and my family's controlling behavior became increasingly obvious to everyone who witnessed it. Margaret treated me like a capable adult temporarily staying with family, while my own family treated me like an unstable child who needed constant supervision. 3 weeks after Sarah's birth, Margaret made a move that changed everything. She arrived at the farm on a Thursday afternoon with a suitcase and a determined expression. "I've come to help take care of Dorothy and the baby," she announced to my startled mother. "That's not necessary," Mama said quickly. "We have everything under control." "I'm sure you do," Margaret replied with a sweet smile that didn't reach her eyes. "But Sarah is my granddaughter too, and I want to make sure I'm doing my part to help. Kevin's working so hard to provide for his family, and I thought Dorothy might enjoy having someone here who understands what it's like to be a new mother." It was brilliant. By framing her presence as additional help rather than interference, Margaret made it impossible for my family to refuse without looking selfish and unreasonable. And by staying in the house, she became a witness to everything that happened. Margaret's presence changed the entire dynamic. Suddenly, my family couldn't monitor every conversation or control every interaction. When they criticized my parenting or made snide comments about Kevin, Margaret was there to offer alternative perspectives. "Dorothy's doing beautifully with Sarah," she'd say when Mama suggested I wasn't feeding the baby correctly. "Every new mother has to find her own rhythm." When Daddy complained about Kevin's job prospects, Margaret would calmly mention the raise Kevin had received the week before, or the commendation letter his supervisor had written, or the extra training program he'd enrolled in to improve his skills. Most importantly, Margaret's presence allowed Kevin and me to have real conversations for the first time since Sarah's birth. While my family was distracted by this new player in their carefully orchestrated drama, Kevin and I were able to plan our next moves. "The lawyer says we need to prove that you're being held here against your will," Kevin told me during one of these conversations. "But we also need to show that you're competent to care for Sarah and that I can provide adequate support." "What does that mean practically?" I asked. "It means we need to document everything they're doing to control you. But we also need to demonstrate that we're responsible parents who can handle this situation." That's when I made a decision that terrified and exhilarated me in equal measure. "I want to go back to work," I announced at dinner the next evening. The silence that followed was deafening. "Work?" Mama finally said. "Dorothy, you just had a baby 3 weeks ago. You can't possibly be thinking about work." "Mrs. Henderson stopped by yesterday," I said calmly. "She said my job is still available whenever I'm ready to come back. Part-time, flexible hours, and I could bring Sarah with me if needed." "Absolutely not," Daddy said immediately. You're not dragging that baby around to some store when she should be home where she can be properly cared for. Sarah would be with me, I replied. Her mother. Caring for her properly. You're not thinking clearly, James interjected. New mothers aren't supposed to make major decisions for at least 6 months after giving birth. It's well known that pregnancy hormones affect judgment. But Margaret spoke up before I could respond. Actually, many women return to work much sooner than that, especially when they have supportive employers. It might be good for Dorothy to have something to focus on besides just feeding schedules and diaper changes. The argument that followed revealed everything about my family's real motivations. They weren't concerned about my health or Sarah's welfare. They were terrified of losing control. If I went back to work, I'd be interacting with people outside their influence. I'd be demonstrating my competence and independence. I'd be showing the community that I was capable of supporting myself and my child. Most dangerously, from their perspective, I'd be taking Sarah with me, proving to everyone that she was healthy, thriving, and well cared for by her mother. I've made up my mind, I said firmly. I start back on Monday, just 3 hours a day to begin with. Mrs. Henderson has already arranged for a comfortable chair and a private area where I can nurse Sarah when needed. Over my dead body, Robert said, his mask of reasonableness finally slipping. Robert, Margaret said quietly, are you saying you have the right to prevent Dorothy from working to support her child? The question hung in the air like a challenge. Because that's exactly what he was saying, and everyone in the room knew it. That weekend, Kevin and Margaret helped me prepare for my return to work. We practiced getting Sarah ready for outings, discussed feeding schedules, and planned how to handle any objections or obstacles my family might create. On Monday morning, I dressed Sarah in one of the outfits Margaret had sewn, packed a diaper bag with supplies, and announced that I was ready to leave for work. You're not taking her anywhere, Thomas said, blocking the front door. Yes, I am, I replied calmly. She's my daughter, and I'm her mother. Where I go, she goes. For a moment, I thought Thomas might physically stop me. But Margaret stepped up beside me, and Kevin's truck pulled into the driveway at exactly the same moment. Problem? Kevin asked as he got out of the truck, his eyes taking in the confrontation at the front door. No problem at all, I said, walking past Thomas with Sarah in my arms. Just going to work. As Kevin drove me to Henderson's Five and Dime that morning, with Sarah sleeping peacefully in the car seat we'd bought with our own money, I felt something I hadn't experienced since before my wedding day. Freedom. For the first time in weeks, I was making my own choices, going where I wanted to go, doing what I needed to do to support my family. And every person who saw me that day, customers, neighbors, Mrs. Henderson, saw a competent young mother taking care of her responsibilities, not a helpless girl who needed family supervision. The war wasn't over, but I had just won my first major battle. Careful, and I was just getting started. Careful, 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 careful. The courtroom in Springfield was nothing like what I'd imagined. It was smaller, more intimate, but somehow that made it more terrifying rather than less. This was where my future would be decided, whether I'd go home with Kevin and Sarah as a family, or whether my daughter would grow up thinking her grandparents were her real parents, and I was just the unstable young woman who couldn't take care of herself. It was January 15, 1971, exactly 6 weeks after Sarah's birth, when Judge William Crawford called our case. Kevin sat beside me at the defendant's table. Yes, we were the defendants in this case, which still strikes me as absurd. While my family sat across the aisle with their lawyer, a well-dressed man from Springfield, who specialized in family law. Our lawyer was younger, less expensive, and frankly less confident, but he had something their lawyer didn't have: the truth. The hearing lasted 3 days. 3 days of testimony, evidence, and revelations that changed not just my life, but the lives of everyone in that courtroom. My family's lawyer presented their case first. They painted a picture of a young couple overwhelmed by responsibilities they couldn't handle, a premature baby who needed specialized care, and a loving family stepping in to provide stability during a crisis. They presented financial records showing Kevin's modest income, medical reports about Sarah's premature birth, and character witnesses who testified to the Richardson family's standing in the community. It was convincing. It was also largely fabricated. When our lawyer cross-examined Dr. Patterson, the truth about Sarah's birth began to emerge. Under oath, Dr. Patterson admitted that he'd been pressured to exaggerate the severity of Sarah's condition in his initial report. Yes, she'd been premature, but she was healthy and thriving. Yes, the birth had been complicated, but no more so than many births he'd attended in homes rather than hospitals. In your professional medical opinion, our lawyer asked, was there any reason why Mrs. O'Brien could not have been safely transported to Springfield General Hospital for delivery? Dr. Patterson squirmed in his seat. In retrospect, the transport would have been possible and perhaps advisable. But you didn't recommend transport at the time. Why was that? The silence stretched for nearly a minute before Dr. Patterson answered. I was told by the family that Mrs. O'Brien had requested a home birth and that transport would be against her wishes. Did you speak directly to Mrs. O'Brien about her preferences? No, I did not. That admission sent a murmur through the courtroom. The judge made a note, his expression growing increasingly stern. But the real bombshell came when Margaret O'Brien took the stand. Margaret had been living in the Richardson house for nearly a month by this point, and she'd been keeping her own careful record of everything she witnessed. Her testimony was devastating to my family's case. She described how I was prevented from making decisions about Sarah's care, how my conversations with Kevin were monitored and restricted, how my family spoke about me in front of visitors as if I were incapable of understanding or participating in discussions about my own life. Did you observe Mrs. O'Brien caring for her daughter during your stay? Our lawyer asked. Every day, Margaret replied firmly. Dorothy is an excellent mother. She's attentive, loving, and completely capable of meeting Sarah's needs. In fact, she often had to insist on caring for Sarah herself because other family members would try to take over feeding, diaper changes, and even basic holding and comforting. In your opinion, was this helpful to Mrs. O'Brien as a new mother? In my opinion, it was harmful. New mothers need to bond with their babies and develop confidence in their abilities. Constantly being told you're doing things wrong or having others take over your responsibilities doesn't help anyone learn or grow. But Margaret's most powerful testimony came when she described a conversation she'd overheard between my father and my brother James. They were discussing plans for Mrs. O'Brien's future, Margaret said, her voice steady but her hands trembling slightly. Mr. Richardson said that Dorothy would never leave the farm again, that they'd make sure Kevin couldn't afford to fight them in court, and that Sarah would be raised, quote, the Richardson way whether Dorothy cooperated or not. The courtroom erupted. Judge Crawford had to bang his gavel repeatedly to restore order. When it was my turn to testify, I was terrified but determined. I told my story simply and honestly, how I'd been taken from my home against my will while in labor, how I'd been prevented from seeking proper medical care, how my family had used legal documents to separate me from my husband and control every aspect of my life. Mrs. O'Brien, the judge asked me directly, do you feel capable of caring for your daughter? Yes, Your Honor, completely. Do you feel your husband is capable of supporting your family? Yes, Your Honor. Kevin has been working extra shifts and has already saved enough money to cover Sarah's medical expenses. We have a home, income, and a strong support system in Kevin's mother. If I were to return custody of your daughter to you today, what would you do? I would take her home, Your Honor, to our house on Maple Street, where her nursery is waiting for her and where she belongs. The judge nodded and made another note. My family's lawyer tried to discredit my testimony, suggesting that I was still suffering from postpartum emotional instability, that I didn't understand the financial realities of raising a child, that I was being manipulated by Kevin and his mother. But every question he asked gave me another opportunity to demonstrate my competence, my love for Sarah, and my determination to be her mother. When Kevin testified, he spoke with a quiet dignity that impressed everyone in the courtroom. He presented our financial records, showing that while we weren't wealthy, we were stable and responsible. He described his plans for supporting our family, including the promotion he'd recently received at the grain elevator, and the part-time accounting work he'd started doing in the evenings. Mr. O'Brien, the judge asked, what would you say to people who might argue that your wife would be better off with her family's financial support? Kevin looked directly at my father when he answered. Your Honor, my wife doesn't need financial support as much as she needs respect, freedom and the right to make her own choices as an adult woman and mother. Money can't buy those things, and no amount of financial security is worth sacrificing your family's independence and dignity. On the third day, Judge Crawford delivered his verdict. "This case," he began, "represents a fundamental misunderstanding of the nature of family relationships and legal guardianship. Emergency guardianship is designed to protect children from immediate harm, not to override the wishes of competent parents or to impose the preferences of extended family members." He went on to methodically dismantle my family's case. The emergency guardianship had been based on false medical information. The claims about my mental incompetence were unsupported by any professional evaluation. The suggestions that Kevin couldn't support his family were contradicted by the evidence. "Most importantly," Judge Crawford said, looking directly at my parents, "the testimony in this case reveals a pattern of behavior that is deeply concerning. Taking a woman in labor away from her chosen medical care, preventing her from making decisions about her own child, and using legal procedures to maintain control over adult family members. These actions represent a fundamental violation of basic human rights and dignity." He paused, letting his words sink in. "Custody of Sarah Margaret O'Brien is hereby returned to her parents, Kevin and Dorothy O'Brien, effective immediately. The emergency guardianship is dissolved, and no further family court intervention is warranted or welcome unless there is credible evidence of actual child endangerment." I burst into tears right there in the courtroom. Kevin wrapped his arms around me, and for the first time in 6 weeks, I felt like I could breathe freely. But Judge Crawford wasn't finished. "Furthermore," he continued, "I am referring this case to the District Attorney's Office for investigation of possible criminal charges related to false imprisonment and filing false legal documents. The behavior described in this courtroom, if accurately reported, may constitute serious crimes that warrant prosecution." My family's lawyer immediately stood to object, but Judge Crawford cut him off. "This hearing is concluded. Mrs. O'Brien, you are free to take your daughter home. The criminal investigation that followed was less satisfying than you might expect. My family ultimately pled guilty to lesser charges and received probation rather than jail time. But the real consequence was social rather than legal. Their reputation in Millerville was permanently damaged. People who had once respected the Richardson name now whispered about what they'd done to their own daughter. Kevin, Sarah, and I moved away from Millerville 6 months later. Kevin got a job at a grain company in Kansas City, and we bought a little house in a suburb where nobody knew our story and nobody cared about our family drama. We just wanted to live quietly and raise our daughter in peace. Sarah grew up knowing the truth about her birth, but in an age-appropriate way. We told her that some family members had made bad choices out of misguided love, but that she should never doubt that she was wanted, loved, and fought for by both her parents. She's 54 years old now, a successful teacher with 3 children of her own. She has a good relationship with Margaret, who became the grandmother figure she needed, and she's even forgiven my family to some extent, though she's never been close to them. As for me, the experience changed the entire trajectory of my life. Seeing how legal procedures could be manipulated to control women's lives made me passionate about women's rights and family law. I went back to school when Sarah started kindergarten, eventually earning a law degree and specializing in cases involving domestic violence and family court abuse. Over the course of my career, I helped hundreds of women navigate situations similar to mine: families using legal systems to maintain control, husbands using children as weapons in divorces, grandparents overstepping boundaries and claiming rights they didn't possess. Every case I won felt like another victory, not just for my client, but for my 18-year-old self who had felt so powerless in that farmhouse. I'm 72 now, officially retired, but still consulting on difficult cases. Kevin and I are still married, still in love, still grateful for the life we built together despite everything that tried to tear us apart. He says I'm too stubborn for my own good, but he says it with a smile because he knows that stubbornness is what saved our family. People sometimes ask me if I regret not reconciling with my birth family before they died. My parents passed away in the 1990s, my brothers over the last decade. The honest answer is complicated. Perhaps a reconciliated word stayed. I regret that they never got to really know Sarah as she grew up. I regret that they missed out on the joy of watching her graduate from college, get married, and have children of her own. I regret that their need for control was stronger than their capacity for love. But I don't regret standing up to them. I don't regret fighting for my right to live my own life and raise my own child. And I don't regret the career I built, helping other women do the same thing. My story isn't unique, unfortunately. Even today, in 2024, there are women whose families try to control their reproductive choices, their marriages, their children's lives. There are grandparents who use legal systems to override parents' decisions. There are families who believe that their love gives them the right to make other people's choices. If you're watching this and seeing yourself in my story, please know that you have rights. You have options. You don't have to accept someone else's vision of what your life should look like, no matter how much they claim to love you. And if you're a young mother feeling overwhelmed and vulnerable, remember that having a baby doesn't make you weak or incompetent. It makes you fierce. It gives you a reason to fight harder than you ever thought possible. Afaspololo mother, trust yourself. Trust your instincts. Trust your love for your child. And never ever let anyone convince you that their control is more important than your freedom. Hafai. That's my story. That's my legacy. And if it helps even one woman find the courage to stand up for herself and her children, then every difficult moment was worth it. Thank you for listening. Thank you for caring. And thank you for believing that women's stories matter. Because they do. We all do. The courtroom in Springfield was nothing like what I'd imagined. It was smaller, more intimate, but somehow that made it more terrifying rather than less. This was where my future would be decided. Whether I'd go home with Kevin and Sarah as a family, or whether my daughter would grow up thinking her grandparents were her real parents, and I was just the unstable young woman who couldn't take care of herself. It was January 15, 1971, exactly 6 weeks after Sarah's birth, when Judge William Crawford called our case. Kevin sat beside me at the defendant's table. Yes, we were the defendants in this case, which still strikes me as absurd. While my family sat across the aisle with their lawyer, a well-dressed man from Springfield who specialized in family law. Our lawyer was younger, less expensive, and frankly, less confident. But he had something their lawyer didn't have: the truth. The hearing lasted 3 days. 3 days of testimony, evidence, and revelations that changed not just my life, but the lives of everyone in that courtroom. My family's lawyer presented their case first. They painted a picture of a young couple overwhelmed by responsibilities they couldn't handle, a premature baby who needed specialized care, and a loving family stepping in to provide stability during a crisis. They presented financial records showing Kevin's modest income, medical reports about Sarah's premature birth, and character witnesses who testified to the Richardson family's standing in the community. It was convincing. It was also largely fabricated. When our lawyer cross-examined Dr. Patterson, the truth about Sarah's birth began to emerge. Under oath, Dr. Patterson admitted that he'd been pressured to exaggerate the severity of Sarah's condition in his initial report. Yes, she'd been premature, but she was healthy and thriving. Yes, the birth had been complicated, but no more so than many births he'd attended in homes rather than hospitals. In your professional medical opinion, our lawyer asked, was there any reason why Mrs. O'Brien could not have been safely transported to Springfield General Hospital for delivery? Dr. Patterson squirmed in his seat. In retrospect, the transport would have been possible and perhaps advisable. But you didn't recommend transport at the time. Why was that? The silence stretched for nearly a minute before Dr. Patterson answered. I was told by the family that Mrs. O'Brien had requested a home birth and that transport would be against her wishes. Did you speak directly to Mrs. O'Brien about her preferences? No, I did not. That admission sent a murmur through the courtroom. The judge made a note, his expression growing increasingly stern. But the real bombshell came when Margaret O'Brien took the stand. Margaret had been living in the Richardson house for nearly a month by this point, and she'd been keeping her own careful record of everything she witnessed. Her testimony was devastating to my family's case. She described how I was prevented from making decisions about Sarah's care, how my conversations with Kevin were monitored and restricted, How my family spoke about me in front of visitors as if I were incapable of understanding or participating in discussions about my own life. Did you observe Mrs. O'Brien caring for her daughter during your stay? Our lawyer asked. Every day, Margaret replied firmly. Dorothy is an excellent mother. She's attentive, loving, and completely capable of meeting Sarah's needs. In fact, she often had to insist on caring for Sarah herself, because other family members would try to take over feeding, diaper changes, and even basic holding and comforting. In your opinion, was this helpful to Mrs. O'Brien as a new mother? In my opinion, it was harmful. New mothers need to bond with their babies and develop confidence in their abilities. Constantly being told you're doing things wrong or having others take over your responsibilities doesn't help anyone learn or grow. But Margaret's most powerful testimony came when she described a conversation she'd overheard between my father and my brother James. They were discussing plans for Mrs. O'Brien's future, Margaret said, her voice steady but her hands trembling slightly. Mr. Richardson said that Dorothy would never leave the farm again, that they'd make sure Kevin couldn't afford to fight them in court, and that Sarah would be raised, quote, the Richardson way, whether Dorothy cooperated or not. The courtroom erupted. Judge Crawford had to bang his gavel repeatedly to restore order. Dirtable away. When it was my turn to testify, I was terrified but determined. I told my story simply and honestly. How I'd been taken from my home against my will while in labor, how I'd been prevented from seeking proper medical care, how my family had used legal documents to separate me from my husband and control every aspect of my life. Mrs. O'Brien, the judge asked me directly, do you feel capable of caring for your daughter? Yes, Your Honor, completely. Do you feel your husband is capable of supporting your family? Yes, Your Honor. Kevin has been working extra shifts and has already saved enough money to cover Sarah's medical expenses. We have a home, income, and a strong support system in Kevin's mother. If I were to return custody of your daughter to you today, what would you do? I would take her home, Your Honor, to our house on Maple Street, where her nursery is waiting for her and where she belongs. The judge nodded and made another note. My family's lawyer tried to discredit my testimony, suggesting that I was still suffering from postpartum emotional instability, that I didn't understand the financial realities of raising a child, that I was being manipulated by Kevin and his mother. But every question he asked gave me another opportunity to demonstrate my competence, my love for Sarah, and my determination to be her mother. When Kevin testified, he spoke with a quiet dignity that impressed everyone in the courtroom. He presented our financial records, showing that while we weren't wealthy, we were stable and responsible. He described his plans for supporting our family, including the promotion he'd recently received at the grain elevator and the part-time accounting work he'd started doing in the evenings. Mr. O'Brien, the judge asked, what would you say to people who might argue that your wife would be better off with her family's financial support? Kevin looked directly at my father when he answered. Your Honor, my wife doesn't need financial support as much as she needs respect, freedom, and the right to make her own choices as an adult woman and mother. Money can't buy those things, and no amount of financial security is worth sacrificing your family's independence and dignity. On the third day, Judge Crawford delivered his verdict. This case, he began, represents a fundamental misunderstanding of the nature of family relationships and legal guardianship. Emergency guardianship is designed to protect children from immediate harm, not to override the wishes of competent parents, or to impose the preferences of extended family members. He went on to methodically dismantle my family's case. The emergency guardianship had been based on false medical information. The claims about my mental incompetence were unsupported by any professional evaluation. The suggestions that Kevin couldn't support his family were contradicted by the evidence. Most importantly, Judge Crawford said, looking directly at my parents, the testimony in this case reveals a pattern of behavior that is deeply concerning. Taking a woman in labor away from her chosen medical care, preventing her from making decisions about her own child, and using legal procedures to maintain control over adult family members. These actions represent a fundamental violation of basic human rights and dignity. He paused, letting his words sink in. Custody of Sarah Margaret O'Brien is hereby returned to her parents, Kevin and Dorothy O'Brien, effective immediately. The emergency guardianship is dissolved, and and no further family court intervention is warranted or welcome unless there is credible evidence of actual child endangerment. I burst into tears right there in the courtroom. Kevin wrapped his arms around me, and for the first time in 6 weeks I felt like I could breathe freely. But Judge Crawford wasn't finished. Furthermore, he continued, I am referring this case to the District Attorney's Office for investigation of possible criminal charges related to false imprisonment and filing false legal documents. The behavior described in this courtroom, if accurately reported, may constitute serious crimes that warrant prosecution. My family's lawyer immediately stood to object, but Judge Crawford cut him off. This hearing is concluded. Mrs. O'Brien, you are free to take your daughter home. The criminal investigation that followed was less satisfying than you might expect. My family ultimately pled guilty to lesser charges and received probation rather than jail time. But the real consequence was social rather than legal. Their reputation in Millerville was permanently damaged. People who had once respected the Richardson name now whispered about what they'd done to their own daughter. Kevin, Sarah, and I moved away from Millerville 6 months later. Kevin got a job at a grain company in Kansas City, and we bought a little house in a suburb where nobody knew our story and nobody cared about our family drama. We just wanted to live quietly and raise our daughter in peace. Sarah grew up knowing the truth about her birth, but in an age-appropriate way. We told her that some family members had made bad choices out of misguided love, but that she should never doubt that she was wanted, loved, and fought for by both her parents. She's 54 years old now, a successful teacher with 3 children of her own. She has a good relationship with Margaret, who became the grandmother figure she needed, and she's even forgiven my family to some extent, though she's never been close to them. As for me, the experience changed the entire trajectory of my life. Seeing how legal procedures could be manipulated to control women's lives made me passionate about women's rights and family law. I went back to school when Sarah started kindergarten, eventually earning a law degree and specializing in cases involving domestic violence and family court abuse. Over the course of my career, I helped hundreds of women navigate situations similar to mine, families using legal systems to maintain control, husbands using children as weapons in divorces, grandparents overstepping boundaries and claiming rights they didn't possess. Every case I won felt like another victory, not just for my client, but for my 18-year-old self, who had felt so powerless in that farmhouse. I'm 72 now, officially retired but still consulting on difficult cases. Kevin and I are still married, still in love, still grateful for the life we built together despite everything that tried to tear us apart. He says I'm too stubborn for my own good, but he says it with a smile, because he knows that stubbornness is what saved our family. People sometimes ask me if I regret not reconciling with my birth family before they died. My parents passed away in the 1990s, my brothers over the last decade. The honest answer is complicated. I regret that they never got to really know Sarah as she grew up. I regret that they missed out on the joy of watching her graduate from college, get married, and have children of her own. I regret that their need for control was stronger than their capacity for love. But I don't regret standing up to them. I don't regret fighting for my right to live my own life and raise my own child. And I don't regret the career I built helping other women do the same thing. My story isn't unique, unfortunately. Even today, in 2024, there are women whose families try to control their reproductive choices, their marriages, their children's lives. There are grandparents who use legal systems to override parents' decisions. There are families who believe that their love gives them the right to make other people's choices. If you're watching this and seeing yourself in my story, please know that you have rights. You have options. You don't have to accept someone else's vision of what your life should look like, no matter how much they claim to love you. And if you're a young mother feeling overwhelmed and vulnerable, remember that having a baby doesn't make you weak or incompetent. It makes you fierce. It gives you a reason to fight harder than you ever thought possible. Trust yourself. Trust your instincts. Trust your love for your child. And never, ever let anyone convince you that their control is more important than your freedom. Possible. That's my story. That's my legacy. And if it helps even one woman find the courage to stand up for herself and her children, then every difficult moment was worth it. Hevana. Thank you for listening. Thank you for caring. And thank you for believing that women's stories matter. Efasafasan, because they do. We all do. Efasam safasan. Efasan. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.